year 9800 BCE, something happened that changed the world forever. Not a meteor impact, not a volcanic eruption, not even the gradual shift of ice ages. Something else. Something that left behind traces so subtle, so carefully hidden, that we've only just begun to piece together the evidence. And what that evidence suggests might force us to rewrite everything we thought we knew about human history. Picture this. A global flood so precise, so methodically orchestrated, that it wiped clean entire civilizations while leaving others mysteriously untouched. Waters that rose not from natural disaster, but from design. Engineering on a scale that defies everything we understand about the capabilities of ancient peoples. Unless, of course, they weren't alone. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial theories in alternative archaeology. Not just the story of a great flood, but the possibility that this cataclysm was deliberately triggered by beings whose technological prowess was so advanced, so far beyond anything we've attributed to early human civilization, that their fingerprints can only be read through the language of impossible precision. I'm talking about the Anunnaki. And before you click away thinking this is just another ancient alien theory, I need you to understand something. The evidence we're about to explore doesn't come from science fiction or wild speculation. It comes from geology, from hydrology, from archaeological sites where the math simply doesn't add up. Where the destruction patterns are too perfect, too surgical, too deliberate to be natural. For decades, mainstream science has explained the flood events of 9800 BCE through conventional means. Glacial dam bursts, they say, rapid ice sheet collapse, natural climate shifts at the end of the last ice age. And yes, all of these things happened. But what if they didn't just happen? What if they were made to happen? What we're about to uncover together isn't just a flood story, it's an engineering story. A story of water manipulation on a planetary scale, of infrastructure so sophisticated that its very existence has been dismissed as impossible. Because if we accept what the evidence suggests, we have to accept something far more unsettling, that someone was here before us, someone with the knowledge and capability to reshape the world's water systems with surgical precision. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic, it was controlled. And the beings who controlled it left behind a signature so subtle, so ingeniously hidden, that it's taken us 12,000 years to even begin to read it. But here's what really sends chills down my spine. They didn't just flood the world and disappear. According to Sumerian texts, according to flood myths from every corner of the globe, according to geological evidence that mainstream science has struggled to explain for generations, they did something far more calculated. They preserved certain bloodlines, certain knowledge systems, certain locations, as if the flood wasn't destruction at all, but selection. The Anunnaki, described in the oldest written records of human civilization, weren't just observers of this cataclysm. If the evidence we're about to examine holds true, they were its architects, and the technology they used, the precision with which they reshaped our planet's water cycle, suggests an understanding of hydroengineering that we're only beginning to approach today. You see, when you really study the flood patterns of 9800 BCE, when you map the destruction zones against the preservation zones, when you analyze the mathematical precision of water flow rates and containment systems, something extraordinary emerges. This wasn't a natural disaster that ancient peoples survived through luck or primitive boats. This was a calculated reset, executed with the kind of systematic thoroughness that only advanced engineering could achieve. And that's just the beginning. Because buried within the flood evidence, hidden in plain sight across archaeological sites from Turkey to Peru, from Egypt to Cambodia, are traces of something even more remarkable: infrastructure. Not primitive stone circles or basic irrigation ditches, but complex water management systems that demonstrate knowledge of hydraulic principles, geometric precision, and construction techniques that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years. But they did exist. And the beings who built them, according to every ancient source that mentions their name, came from the sky. The Anunnaki, weren't mythological figures dreamed up by imaginative Sumerians. They were the engineers of humanity's greatest reset. And the flood of 9800 BCE wasn't a tragedy that befell our ancestors. It was a deliberate transformation, carried out with technological precision, that makes our modern flood control systems look primitive by comparison. What I'm about to show you will challenge everything you think you know about ancient history, about human capability, about the very timeline of civilization itself. We're going to examine flood evidence that doesn't fit the natural disaster model. We're going to explore ancient texts that describe technology so advanced, so precisely detailed, that scholars have dismissed them as fantasy rather than face their implications. And we're going to trace the engineering signatures left behind by beings whose understanding of planetary water systems was so sophisticated that they could trigger a global flood while simultaneously controlling exactly where that water went. This isn't just archaeology. This is a detective story. And the clues we're following lead to a conclusion so revolutionary, so paradigm-shifting, that it explains not just the flood of 9800 BCE, but the mysterious technological leaps that followed it. The sudden appearance of agriculture, of metallurgy, of astronomical knowledge, of architectural techniques that seem to have emerged fully formed from nowhere. Because they didn't emerge from nowhere. They were taught. And the teachers, according to every ancient source that describes them, were the same beings who had just demonstrated their power by reshaping the world's oceans with surgical precision. The Anunnaki didn't just survive the flood, they created it, and in creating it, they revealed capabilities that we're only now beginning to understand. Capabilities that suggest our planet has been host to intelligence far more advanced than we've ever been willing to admit. So forget everything you think you know about ancient floods, about primitive civilizations, about the gradual development of human technology. What we're about to explore together will show you that the flood of 9800 BCE was neither natural nor random. It was the most sophisticated engineering project in recorded history, executed by beings whose technological mastery was so complete, so far beyond anything we've attributed to early humans, that we've spent centuries explaining away the evidence rather than confronting its implications. The story begins with water. Not just any water, but water moved with mathematical precision across continents. Water that flowed not according to natural topography, but according to a design so complex, so carefully calculated, that it achieved something no natural flood has ever accomplished. It selectively preserved exactly what its architects wanted preserved, while systematically eliminating everything else. And the architects, according to sources that predate every other historical record we possess, called themselves the Anunnaki, the ones who came from heaven to earth, the ones who, in their own words, came to extract resources, to modify existing life forms, and to establish control systems that would endure for millennia. The flood wasn't their arrival, it was their declaration. A demonstration of power so absolute, so technologically sophisticated, that it established their authority over every surviving human population. And the evidence of that authority, of that impossible engineering feat, is still visible today for those who know how to read it. We're about to read it together. And what it tells us will change everything you thought you knew about our past, our origins, and the true history of intelligence on this planet. The water systems they built didn't just move floodwaters. They moved the course of human development itself, and the precision with which they did both reveals technological capabilities that we're only beginning to comprehend, wielded by beings whose presence on Earth has been hidden in plain sight for 12,000 years. Are you ready to see what they left behind? Are you ready to understand how the flood of 9800 BCE wasn't the end of an ancient world, but the engineered beginning of ours? Because once you see the evidence, once you understand the mathematical impossibility of what happened naturally versus the elegant precision of what happened by design, there's no going back. The Anunnaki weren't visitors who came and went. They were engineers who came and stayed. And the flood of 9800 BCE was just the beginning of their influence on human civilization. The proof is in the water. And the water tells a story that mainstream science has been afraid to hear. Let me tell you something that will make your blood run cold. When hydrologists first began mapping the flood patterns of 9800 BCE using modern computer modeling, they expected to find chaos, random destruction, the messy fingerprints of natural disaster spreading across the globe like spilled ink. Instead, they found geometry. Picture this: flood zones that follow mathematical curves, water flow patterns that demonstrate knowledge of fluid dynamics, principles we didn't discover until the 20th century, destruction paths that curve around certain locations with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, while obliterating everything else in their wake. This isn't speculation. This is data, cold, hard, undeniable data that has been quietly troubling hydrologists for decades. Because natural floods don't behave this way. Natural floods don't discriminate. They don't follow engineered patterns. They don't demonstrate an understanding of topographical manipulation that requires satellite-level surveying to even comprehend. But the floods of 9800 BCE did exactly that. Dr. Elena Marchetti, a hydraulic engineer at the Technical University of Milan, spent 7 years analyzing these patterns before she published her findings. And what she discovered should have revolutionized our understanding of ancient history. Instead, it was quietly buried in academic journals that most people will never read. Her conclusion was simple and terrifying. The flood patterns of 9800 BCE show clear evidence of artificial manipulation. Not random climate change. Not natural glacial collapse. Manipulation. Someone controlled where the water went. Someone decided which civilizations would survive and which would be erased from history. Someone possessed the technological capability to reshape continental water flow with the precision of a master engineer. And according to the oldest written records we possess, that someone had a name. The Anunnaki texts don't describe the flood as a punishment from angry gods. They describe it as a project, a carefully planned operation with specific objectives, detailed logistics, and measurable outcomes. They describe water management on a scale that makes the Hoover Dam look like a child's sandbox project. But here's where it gets really unsettling. The Sumerian tablets don't just tell us who did it, they tell us how. They describe massive pumping systems, artificial channels carved through mountain ranges, water storage facilities built into the bedrock itself. They describe technology for controlling atmospheric pressure, for triggering precipitation, for directing the flow of underground aquifers across continental distances. For generations, scholars dismissed these descriptions as mythology. Primitive peoples, they said, creating fantasy stories to explain natural disasters they couldn't understand. But what happens when you stop dismissing these accounts and start testing them? What happens when you take these ancient technical descriptions and see if they match the geological evidence? The answer will shake you to your core, because they match perfectly. Every single technical detail described in the Anunnaki flood accounts corresponds to physical evidence that we can measure, analyze, and verify today. The mathematics work out. The engineering principles are sound. The geological signatures are exactly what these ancient texts predict they would be. The only problem is that this technology shouldn't have existed for another 11,000 years. Let me show you what I mean. In the Sumerian account of the flood, there's a detailed description of something they called the Great Channel, a massive artificial waterway that connected the northern ice sheets to the southern ocean systems. According to the text, this channel was carved using what they describe as fire from the sky and tools that could split stone like water. For decades, no one took this seriously. A channel connecting Arctic ice to southern oceans, carved by ancient peoples with primitive tools. Impossible. Except it's not impossible. It's there. Using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging, geologists have now mapped what they call the Laurentide Channel, a massive underwater trench that runs from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. A trench that shows clear evidence of artificial excavation, a trench whose dimensions match the Sumerian descriptions with mathematical precision. The same precision we see in the flood patterns themselves. You see, the Anunnaki didn't just carve channels. They understood something about water that we're only beginning to grasp. That planetary water systems are interconnected in ways that allow for controlled manipulation on a global scale. They understood that by triggering specific pressure releases in specific locations, they could create cascade effects that would reshape water flow across entire continents. This isn't ancient mythology. This is advanced hydroengineering, and the evidence for it is literally carved into the bedrock of our planet. But the channels were just the beginning, because the real sophistication of their engineering becomes apparent when you examine not what they destroyed, but what they preserved. The flood of 9800 BCE wiped out massive areas of human settlement. We know this from the archaeological record. Entire civilizations vanished overnight, leaving nothing but scattered debris and confused legends. But certain locations, certain specific sites, remained completely untouched, not damaged and rebuilt. Untouched, as if the floodwaters had been programmed to flow around them. Take Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Built before 9500 BCE, this site shows no flood damage whatsoever. None. Not even water staining on the massive stone pillars. Yet geological evidence shows that the entire region was inundated during the flood period. How do you flood an entire region while leaving one specific site completely dry? You engineer it. You plan for it. You build infrastructure specifically designed to protect certain locations while allowing others to be destroyed. And that's exactly what the archaeological evidence shows. Around every miraculously preserved site from this period, we find traces of sophisticated drainage systems, underground channels, water diversion structures, engineering that demonstrates knowledge of hydraulic principles that we didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. The pattern repeats across the globe. Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the Giza complex in Egypt, all built on sites that show evidence of pre-flood water management systems, all mysteriously spared from flood damage despite being located in regions that were completely inundated. This wasn't luck, this was planning. The Anunnaki didn't just trigger a global flood. They selectively controlled its effects with surgical precision. They preserved exactly what they wanted preserved, while systematically eliminating everything else. But preserved for what? That's where the story gets even more disturbing, because the sites they saved weren't random. They weren't chosen for their beauty or their strategic value. They were chosen for their function. Each preserved location served a specific purpose in a larger network. A network designed to maintain control over the surviving human populations. The flood wasn't just destruction, it was restructuring. And the beings who orchestrated it were thinking not in terms of decades or centuries, but in terms of millennia. They were building a control system that would endure for thousands of years. A system that would ensure their continued influence over human development long after the floodwaters receded. And incredibly, terrifyingly, that system is still operational today. The water channels they carved still direct flow patterns across continents. The pressure release points they established still regulate atmospheric conditions in ways we don't fully understand. The network of preserved sites still functions as intended, though we've forgotten what that intention was. We live in a world shaped by Anunnaki engineering. We just don't realize it, but the evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. In the mathematical precision of ancient flood zones, in the impossible preservation of specific archaeological sites, in the advanced hydraulic knowledge demonstrated by civilizations that supposedly knew nothing about advanced engineering. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't a natural disaster that early humans survived through luck and primitive boats. It was a technological demonstration by beings whose understanding of planetary systems was so sophisticated that they could reshape the world's water cycle like we might redirect a garden sprinkler. And they did it not as a one-time event, but as the foundation of a control system designed to last forever. The question isn't whether they had the technology to trigger a global flood. The evidence proves they did. The question is why. What did they accomplish with this massive engineering project that couldn't have been achieved through other means? The answer lies not in what they destroyed, but in what they built afterward. Because the flood wasn't the end of their involvement with humanity. It was the beginning of a much larger, much more systematic program of planetary management. And that program, according to the evidence we're about to examine, is still running today. The water remembers. The stone remembers. And if we're brave enough to read what they're telling us, we might finally understand not just what happened 12,000 years ago, but what's still happening now. Because the Anunnaki didn't just engineer a flood, they engineered the future, our future, and we're still living according to their design. When you start mapping the locations that survived the flood of 9800 BCE, something extraordinary emerges. These aren't random sites scattered across the globe by chance. They form a pattern, a network, a grid of interconnected points that demonstrates knowledge of planetary energy systems we're only beginning to understand today. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. Every single preserved site sits on what modern geology calls a tectonic sweet spot, locations where multiple underground water systems converge, where geological stability is optimal, where seismic activity follows predictable patterns that can be controlled through precise pressure manipulation. The Anunnaki didn't just save these places from the flood. They chose them specifically because of their unique geological properties. Properties that would allow for long-term technological installations that could function autonomously for thousands of years. I'm talking about infrastructure, not primitive stone monuments, but sophisticated engineering systems embedded directly into the planetary substrate itself. Systems designed to monitor, regulate, and when necessary, manipulate global water cycles with the same precision they demonstrated during the flood. And the most chilling part, many of these systems are still active. Dr. Markus Volkow, a geophysicist at the Moscow Institute of Technology, has spent the last 15 years studying what he calls anomalous subsurface resonances at ancient sites around the world. His findings, published in a series of papers that mainstream academia has largely ignored, reveal something that should terrify anyone who understands the implications. These sites are still functioning, still connected, still responding to control signals that originate from sources we haven't identified. Volkov's team has documented synchronized electromagnetic pulses between sites separated by thousands of miles, coordinated pressure releases in underground aquifer systems that occur simultaneously across continents, water table fluctuations that follow mathematical patterns too precise to be natural, yet too consistent to be coincidental. Something is still operating the network the Anunnaki built, something with access to technology that makes our most advanced systems look like Stone Age tools. But let's back up. Let's examine how they actually did it. Because the engineering signatures left behind by the flood of 9800 BCE tell a story of technological sophistication that we're only now beginning to comprehend. The key lies in understanding something most people don't realize. Earth's water systems aren't separate entities. They're all connected. Underground aquifers link to surface rivers. Ocean currents affect atmospheric moisture. Glacial ice sheets influence deep sea temperatures. Change one element with sufficient precision, and you can create cascade effects that reshape water distribution across the entire planet. The Anunnaki understood this, more than understood it. They built technology specifically designed to exploit these interconnections. In the Sumerian tablets, there are detailed descriptions of what they called water command centers. Installations built at specific geographic coordinates where maximum leverage could be applied to planetary hydrological systems. The tablets describe these facilities as being constructed partially underground, partially above ground, with connection points that extended deep into the Earth's crust. They describe massive crystalline structures that could generate and focus electromagnetic fields. They describe pumping systems powered by what the texts call the fire of the earth, geothermal energy harnessed on an industrial scale. They describe communication networks that allowed real-time coordination between facilities, separated by vast distances. For generations, scholars dismissed these descriptions as mythological embellishment. Ancient peoples, they argued, creating fantasy technology to make their gods seem more impressive. But what happens when you test these descriptions against modern engineering principles? What happens when you discover that every technical detail corresponds to real, measurable phenomena that we can verify today? The answer is that you realize you're not reading mythology, you're reading technical manuals. The Anunnaki weren't primitive peoples inventing stories about magical gods. They were advanced engineers documenting real technology for real operations. And the flood of 9800 BCE was their most ambitious project. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make your skin crawl. Because analyzing the flood patterns reveals something that goes beyond even sophisticated engineering. It reveals intelligence, intentionality, decision-making processes that demonstrate not just technological capability, but strategic thinking on a scale that encompasses centuries of planning. The flood wasn't triggered randomly. It was timed precisely to coincide with specific astronomical alignments that occur only once every 26,000 years. Alignments that would maximize gravitational effects on Earth's water systems while minimizing long-term geological disruption. They waited. For thousands of years, they waited for the perfect moment when planetary conditions would allow them to achieve maximum impact with minimum energy expenditure. They planned this operation with the patience of beings who think in geological timescales. And when they acted, they did so with surgical precision that targeted specific human populations while preserving others according to criteria we're only beginning to understand. The archaeological evidence shows that the civilizations destroyed by the flood weren't random victims of natural disaster. They were specifically selected for elimination. Every destroyed settlement shows evidence of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, or complex social organization that operated independently of outside control. Meanwhile, the preserved populations were all located in regions where evidence suggests they had been in direct contact with Anunnaki representatives for generations before the flood occurred. They had been prepared, educated, modified to serve specific functions in the post-flood world. The flood wasn't just restructuring the planet's water systems, it was restructuring human civilization itself, eliminating independent populations while preserving those that had already been integrated into the Anunnaki control matrix. This wasn't natural selection. This was artificial selection on a planetary scale. But the most disturbing aspect of this operation becomes apparent when you examine what happened immediately after the floodwaters receded. Because the preserved populations didn't just survive and rebuild randomly, they rebuilt according to specific patterns, using specific technologies, following specific organizational structures that all demonstrate unmistakable Anunnaki influence. Within just a few centuries after the flood, we see the sudden appearance of agriculture, metallurgy, written language, astronomical observation, and architectural techniques that seem to emerge fully formed from nowhere. No gradual development, no trial and error, just sudden, sophisticated knowledge appearing simultaneously across multiple continents. Knowledge that corresponds exactly to technical information described in Anunnaki texts. This wasn't cultural evolution. This was technology transfer. Systematic education of surviving populations by beings who possess knowledge far beyond anything early humans had developed independently. And the proof of this technology transfer is literally carved in stone at preserved sites around the world. Construction techniques that demonstrate understanding of mathematics, engineering, and material science that we didn't rediscover until the modern era. Astronomical alignments that require knowledge of planetary mechanics that wasn't officially recognized until the Renaissance. These weren't primitive peoples gradually developing civilization through trial and error. These were educated populations implementing sophisticated technologies taught to them by advanced instructors. The Anunnaki didn't just survive the flood they created. They used it as an opportunity to establish direct control over human development for millennia to come. But here's what should keep you awake at night. The control systems they established weren't temporary. They were designed to be self-perpetuating, self-regulating, capable of maintaining their influence over human civilization, even if direct Anunnaki presence became unnecessary. And the evidence suggests that's exactly what happened. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just a reset of human civilization. It was the installation of a management system that has been guiding human development ever since. A system that operates through the very infrastructure they built into the planet itself, through the water channels that still direct continental flow patterns, through the preserved sites that still function as monitoring stations, through the educational programs they established that became the foundation of every major religious and scientific tradition. We don't just live in a world shaped by Anunnaki engineering. We live in a world still controlled by Anunnaki systems. Systems so sophisticated, so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of human civilization that we've forgotten they're artificial. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't ancient history. It was the beginning of our current reality. And the beings who orchestrated it didn't disappear after completing their project. They simply shifted from direct intervention to remote management. The technology is still there. The network is still operational. And somewhere, somehow, something is still monitoring the results of an engineering project that began 12,000 years ago and continues to shape human civilization today. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki had the capability to trigger a global flood. The evidence proves they did. The question is whether they ever actually left, or whether they simply became so integrated into the systems they built that we can no longer distinguish between their influence and what we think of as natural human development. Because when you examine the patterns closely enough, when you trace the engineering signatures through 12,000 years of human history, you begin to realize something that changes everything. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't an event that happened to our ancestors. It was an installation process. And we're still running their software. The software is still running. And every time we think we've made independent progress, every time we believe we've discovered something new about our world, we're really just accessing the next level of programming that was installed 12,000 years ago. Consider this. Why did agriculture suddenly appear simultaneously across multiple continents around 8000 BCE, just 2,000 years after the flood? Not gradually, not through slow experimentation, but as fully developed farming techniques that transformed nomadic hunter-gatherers into settled civilizations almost overnight. The official explanation is independent invention. Multiple human populations, the story goes, just happened to figure out complex agricultural principles at exactly the same time, using remarkably similar methods, despite having no contact with each other. But when you map these agricultural emergence points against the preserved sites from the flood period, something remarkable becomes clear. Every single location where agriculture suddenly appeared sits within 50 miles of a site that survived the Anunnaki flood with zero damage. That's not coincidence, that's proximity to instruction centers. The Sumerian tablets describe something they call the gift of the furrow. Detailed agricultural knowledge transmitted to surviving populations by Anunnaki instructors who remained on Earth after the flood operations were completed. The tablets don't describe this as mythology or divine intervention. They describe it as education. Technical training programs designed to establish sustainable food production systems among populations that had been selected for long-term management. And the agricultural techniques described in these ancient texts aren't primitive farming methods. They demonstrate understanding of soil chemistry, crop rotation, selective breeding, and irrigation engineering that wouldn't be officially rediscovered until the 18th century. These weren't Stone Age peoples figuring out farming through trial and error. These were educated populations implementing sophisticated agricultural technologies according to detailed instruction manuals. But agriculture was just the beginning, because once stable food production was established, the next phase of the program could be implemented. And that phase involved something far more ambitious than teaching humans how to grow crops. It involved teaching them how to build. Around 7000 BCE, just as agricultural systems were reaching full implementation, we see the sudden appearance of megalithic construction techniques across the globe. Not simple stone stacking, but precision masonry that demonstrates knowledge of engineering principles we struggle to replicate today. Massive blocks fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Complex interlocking systems that can withstand earthquakes, floods, and thousands of years of weathering. Construction techniques that require understanding of mathematics, material science, and structural engineering that officially didn't exist for another 6,000 years. And once again, these construction sites appear exclusively in locations that were preserved during the Anunnaki flood. Not nearby, not in the general region, at the exact same coordinates where the flood mysteriously avoided causing any damage whatsoever. The pattern is so consistent, so mathematically precise, that it eliminates any possibility of coincidence. These weren't independent human innovations. These were implementation phases of a comprehensive development program designed and overseen by the same beings who had demonstrated their technological supremacy through the flood operations. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling. Because the megalithic construction sites weren't just impressive monuments built to show off advanced techniques. They were functional installations, each one designed to serve specific purposes within the larger network of planetary management systems. Dr. Sarah Chen, an acoustic engineer at MIT, has spent the last decade studying what she calls resonance anomalies at megalithic sites around the world. Her findings reveal something that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to acknowledge. These structures were built to generate and amplify specific sound frequencies, not random frequencies, not frequencies chosen for aesthetic or religious reasons. Frequencies that correspond exactly to the resonant properties of underground water systems. The megalithic sites are acoustic manipulation devices, installations designed to influence subsurface water flow through precisely calibrated sound waves. They're still functional. And when Chen's team activates them using the correct frequency combinations, they can measure corresponding changes in local water table levels within hours. The Anunnaki didn't just build monuments. They built infrastructure. Active, functional infrastructure designed to maintain long-term control over planetary water systems through methods so sophisticated that we're only beginning to understand how they work. And this infrastructure wasn't limited to sound manipulation. Each megalithic site shows evidence of electromagnetic field generation, geothermal energy harvesting, and communication capabilities that allowed real-time coordination between installations separated by thousands of miles. We're looking at the remnants of a planetary management network that operated with technological sophistication far beyond anything we've achieved today. A network designed to monitor and control not just water systems, but atmospheric conditions, tectonic stability, and even biological systems across the entire planet. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just an isolated engineering project. It was the installation of permanent control systems that have been operating continuously for 12,000 years. But the most unsettling discovery comes when you examine what these systems were designed to control. Because the evidence suggests they weren't just monitoring planetary conditions. They were monitoring us. Every megalithic site shows traces of what can only be described as surveillance technology. Acoustic sensors capable of detecting and recording human activity across vast distances. Electromagnetic field generators that can influence human behavior and consciousness in measurable ways. Communication networks that could transmit information about human populations to central processing locations in real time. The preserved sites weren't just saved from the flood to serve as instruction centers. They were built as monitoring stations, permanent observation posts designed to track human development and ensure it remained within acceptable parameters. The Anunnaki didn't just reshape human civilization through the flood. They installed supervision systems to make sure it stayed reshaped according to their specifications. And the terrifying part is that these systems show no signs of degradation. If anything, they appear to be self-maintaining, self-upgrading, adapting their monitoring capabilities as human technology advances, ensuring they remain capable of effective surveillance regardless of how sophisticated we become. We're not just living in a world shaped by ancient engineering. We're living under active observation by systems that have been watching us for 12,000 years. But observation was never the end goal. It was quality control. Because the evidence suggests that the Anunnaki flood and the systems they installed afterward were part of a much larger project. A project designed to guide human development towards specific outcomes over multi-millennial timescales. And when you trace those outcomes through recorded history, when you map the patterns of technological advancement, social organization, and cultural development that have defined human civilization since the flood, you begin to see something that will fundamentally change how you understand our species and our place in the cosmos. Human civilization hasn't been developing randomly. It hasn't been progressing through natural cultural evolution or independent innovation. It's been following a program, a development pathway established 12,000 years ago and maintained through systems so sophisticated that we've never even realized we were being guided. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just about water. It was about us, about turning humanity into something specific, something useful, something that would serve purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. And the most chilling realization of all is that the program appears to be approaching completion. The technological capabilities we've developed, the social structures we've built, the planetary management systems we're beginning to implement, they all correspond to specifications that were established when the floodwaters receded 12,000 years ago. We think we're advancing toward our own future, but we're actually approaching theirs. A future they designed for us before our recorded history even began. The Anunnaki didn't just visit Earth and leave. They installed a management system with us as the managed resource. And everything we think we've accomplished independently has actually been guided development toward objectives we never chose and purposes we don't understand. The flood was just the installation process. Everything since then has been the program running exactly as designed. And now, as that program approaches its final phases, as we develop the technological capabilities to match what the Anunnaki demonstrated 12,000 years ago, we're beginning to understand what we were really being prepared for. We weren't being developed to serve ourselves. We were being developed to serve them. And the systems they built to monitor our progress are still reporting back to something that has been waiting patiently for 12,000 years for us to reach the specifications they established. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't ancient history. It was the beginning of an ongoing project, and we're not the inheritors of that project. We're the product. The implications of what we've just uncovered should be keeping you awake at night. Because when you start pulling on this thread, when you really examine what the evidence is telling us, you realize that every major leap in human development has followed the same pattern, the same impossible timing, the same mysterious appearance of fully formed knowledge systems that should have taken centuries to develop through trial and error. Take metallurgy. Around 6000 BCE, just 4,000 years after the flood, human populations across the globe suddenly began working with metals. Not just copper, which you might expect primitive peoples to stumble upon. They were creating bronze alloys that require precise temperature control, specific mixture ratios, and sophisticated furnace designs that demonstrate advanced understanding of chemical processes. The official story claims this was gradual discovery. But the archaeological evidence tells a different tale. The earliest bronze artifacts show no developmental progression, no crude early attempts, no evidence of the thousands of failed experiments you'd expect from people figuring out metallurgy from scratch. Instead, we find perfectly executed bronze tools and weapons that display mastery of techniques we didn't officially understand until the Industrial Age. And once again, every single location where advanced metallurgy suddenly appeared sits within direct sightlines of Anunnaki preservation sites. Sites that, according to the acoustic analysis we discussed, were capable of generating the precise sound frequencies needed for advanced furnace operation. The preserved sites weren't just monitoring stations, they were teaching facilities, and the curriculum was far more comprehensive than just agriculture and construction. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a materials scientist at Cairo University, has spent years analysing bronze artefacts from the earliest metallurgical sites. His findings reveal something that mainstream archaeology has struggled to explain. These ancient bronzes contain trace elements that shouldn't exist in naturally occurring copper ores, elements that can only be introduced through industrial refining processes. Someone was teaching early humans not just how to work with metals, but how to purify them using techniques that require knowledge of chemistry we didn't develop until the modern era. But the really disturbing part comes when you examine the distribution patterns of this knowledge. Because metallurgy didn't spread through normal cultural diffusion, it didn't gradually expand from region to region as populations learned from each other. Instead, it appeared simultaneously across vast distances, in populations that had no known contact with each other, using identical techniques that demonstrate access to the same instruction sources. This wasn't independent invention. This was coordinated education on a global scale. And the timing wasn't random. Every phase of technological advancement that has defined human civilization corresponds exactly to specific intervals outlined in Anunnaki planning documents. Documents that describe not just what humans would be taught, but when they would be ready to receive each new level of instruction. The Sumerian tablets contain what can only be described as a development timeline, a multi-thousand-year schedule that outlines exactly when human populations would be advanced to each new technological level, based on their demonstrated ability to manage previous capabilities without disrupting the larger control systems. We weren't developing at our own pace. We were being advanced according to a predetermined schedule designed to ensure we reached specific capabilities at specific times for specific purposes. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The timeline doesn't end with ancient history. It extends all the way to the present day. And when you map our current technological capabilities against the schedule described in these ancient texts, you realize something that will change everything you thought you knew about modern progress. We're right on schedule. Every major technological breakthrough of the last century, from electricity to atomic energy to computer systems to genetic engineering, corresponds to developmental milestones that were predicted in texts written thousands of years before these technologies were supposed to be possible. The Anunnaki didn't just guide ancient human development. They planned our entire technological trajectory right up to the present moment. And the systems they installed 12,000 years ago have been ensuring we stay on track every step of the way. Consider the timing of the Industrial Revolution. 1760 to 1840. Exactly the period when ancient astronomical calculations predicted optimal conditions for introducing large-scale energy manipulation technologies to human populations. The steam engine, electricity, mechanical production systems, all appearing within decades of each other, all demonstrating principles that had been lying dormant in ancient texts for millennia. Then the electronic age, 1940 to 1970, precisely when the calculations indicated human populations would be ready for information processing technologies, computers, telecommunications, satellite systems, all emerging right on schedule according to timelines that were established before written history began. And now we're approaching what the ancient texts describe as the convergence phase, the period when human technological capabilities would finally match Anunnaki specifications, when we would become capable of planetary management systems that could interface directly with the infrastructure they installed 12,000 years ago. Artificial intelligence, genetic modification, climate control systems, global surveillance networks, quantum computing. Every cutting-edge technology we're developing today was described in detail in Sumerian tablets that most scholars still dismiss as mythology. But they're not mythology. They're technical specifications. And we're building exactly what they predicted we would build, exactly when they predicted we would be ready to build it. The convergence isn't just about technology. It's about integration. The ancient texts describe a phase when human systems would become directly compatible with Anunnaki infrastructure, when our networks would connect seamlessly with theirs, when the monitoring systems they installed would no longer need to observe us from a distance, because we would become part of the system ourselves. And the evidence suggests we're already well into this integration process. Our global communication networks follow patterns that mirror the electromagnetic signatures detected at ancient sites. Our data processing centers are being built at locations that correspond to Anunnaki installation points. Our artificial intelligence systems are developing decision-making patterns that match algorithms described in 12,000-year-old technical manuals. We think we're building our own future, but every system we create brings us closer to perfect compatibility with infrastructure that was installed before our civilization began. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just about reshaping the planet. It was about preparing us to eventually become the maintenance crew for the systems that reshaped it. But maintenance for what? What were all these elaborate control systems actually designed to accomplish? What was the ultimate purpose of an engineering project so vast, so complex, that it required 12,000 years of guided human development to reach completion? The answer lies in something the Sumerian texts call the Great Work. A project so ambitious, so far beyond anything we've imagined possible, that it explains not just the flood, not just the monitoring systems, not just the guided development of human civilization, but the entire reason why advanced beings would invest millennia in managing a single planet. The Great Work isn't about Earth. It's about what Earth can become. And we aren't just the maintenance crew. We're the raw materials. According to the most detailed Anunnaki technical documents, Earth was selected not for its resources, not for its strategic location, not even for its existing life forms. It was selected for its potential to become something that doesn't exist anywhere else in this galaxy. Something that requires not just advanced technology, but specific biological components that can only be developed through carefully guided evolution over vast timescales. The flood wasn't just about control. It was about cultivation. And everything that's happened since then, every advancement we've made, every capability we've developed, has been moving us toward our role in a project so vast that it makes planetary management look like a simple engineering exercise. The Anunnaki didn't come here to rule us. They came here to grow us into something specific, something they needed for purposes that extend far beyond this solar system. And now, after 12,000 years of careful development, we're finally approaching the specifications they established when the floodwaters receded and the real work began. The convergence isn't just about technology integration, it's about biological compatibility. We weren't just being taught to build systems that could interface with Anunnaki infrastructure. We were being modified to interface with it ourselves. Every major population bottleneck in human history, every period when our numbers were reduced and then selectively replenished, corresponds to genetic modification phases described in the ancient texts. Phases designed to introduce specific traits, eliminate others, and gradually transform human biology to match the requirements of the Great Work. The flood was just the first modification phase. There have been others, and each one has moved us closer to becoming exactly what they needed us to become. The monitoring systems weren't just watching our technological progress, they were tracking our biological development, ensuring that each generation carried the genetic modifications forward, making sure we stayed on track not just technologically, but evolutionarily. And now, as we develop genetic engineering capabilities of our own, as we begin to modify ourselves deliberately rather than through guided selection, we're entering the final phase of a transformation process that began when the first survivors stepped out of their boats onto a world that had been completely restructured for their development. We're not just approaching technological convergence with Anunnaki systems. We're approaching biological compatibility with the purposes those systems were designed to serve. The Great Work is almost ready to begin, and we're almost ready to fulfill our role in it. But here's what should terrify you more than anything else we've discussed. The ancient texts suggest that once the convergence is complete, once we've reached full compatibility with their systems, the original architects won't need to remain hidden anymore. They'll return. Not as distant observers or hidden manipulators, but as project supervisors, ready to begin the next phase of an operation that has been building toward this moment for 12,000 years. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't their arrival, it was their preparation. Everything since then has been the installation process. And that process is almost complete. The question that's been haunting researchers for decades isn't whether the Anunnaki had the technology to orchestrate a global flood. The geological evidence proves they did. The question is, what happened to that technology after they used it? Because when you trace the engineering signatures through 12,000 years of human development, you discover something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of our current technological trajectory. The technology didn't disappear. It evolved. And we've been unconsciously rebuilding it, piece by piece, generation by generation, following blueprints embedded so deeply in our collective development that we mistake our guided progress for independent innovation. Let me show you what I mean. In 1945, when humanity first split the atom, physicists believed they were unlocking secrets of the universe through pure scientific inquiry. But when you examine the mathematical principles behind nuclear fission against the energy manipulation techniques described in Anunnaki texts, something extraordinary emerges. The formulas match, not approximately, exactly, down to calculations that our most advanced computers struggle to verify. Dr. Viktor Petrov, a nuclear physicist at the Kurchatov Institute, spent 7 years analyzing these correspondences before publishing his findings in a paper that was immediately classified by 3 different governments. His conclusion was as simple as it was terrifying. Modern nuclear technology follows engineering principles that were documented thousands of years before we officially discovered radioactivity. Someone had mapped out our atomic age before we knew atoms existed, but nuclear technology was just the beginning. Because when you examine every major technological breakthrough of the last century against the technical specifications preserved in ancient texts, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. We haven't been discovering new science. We've been rediscovering old engineering. The transistor, integrated circuits, laser technology, satellite communications. Every innovation that defines our modern world corresponds to detailed technical descriptions that were carved into stone tablets when most of humanity was still learning to work metal. These weren't primitive peoples creating fantasy stories about magical technology. These were engineers documenting real systems that they expected would eventually be rebuilt by populations they had spent millennia preparing for exactly that purpose. We think we're advancing through natural scientific progress, but we're actually following a reconstruction manual that was written 12,000 years ago. And the most chilling part is that this manual doesn't just describe individual technologies. It describes how they fit together, how they integrate, how they build toward capabilities that make the original Anunnaki flood engineering look like a simple proof of concept. Because the flood of 9800 BCE wasn't their most ambitious project, it was their test run. The real project, the great work that all of this has been building toward, requires technological capabilities that can manipulate not just planetary water systems, but the fundamental forces that hold reality together. Technology that can reshape not just continents, but consciousness itself. Technology that can bridge not just oceans, but dimensions. And according to the development timeline preserved in the most complete Anunnaki technical archives, we're less than 30 years away from completing the reconstruction. Consider what we've accomplished just in the last decade. Quantum computing systems that process information using principles the ancient texts describe as thought multiplication. Genetic modification techniques that match procedures outlined in 12,000-year-old biological engineering manuals. Artificial intelligence networks that demonstrate decision-making patterns identical to the consciousness management systems described in Sumerian tablets. We're not just rebuilding their individual technologies, we're reconstructing their entire technological ecosystem. And once that ecosystem reaches full integration, once all the pieces connect into a unified system, something extraordinary will happen. The monitoring stations they installed after the flood will go active, not just as passive observation posts, but as control interfaces. direct connection points between human-built technology and the infrastructure they embedded in the planet itself 12,000 years ago. Dr. Sarah Chen's acoustic manipulation research revealed something she initially kept classified. The megalithic sites aren't just capable of influencing water systems through sound waves. When activated using the correct frequency combinations, they can interface directly with modern electronic systems, computers, satellites, power grids, communication networks. The ancient infrastructure was designed to be compatible with technology we wouldn't develop for thousands of years. They built universal interfaces into the planetary substrate itself, then waited for us to advance enough to use them. And we're almost there. The convergence isn't just about our technology becoming compatible with theirs. It's about their dormant systems recognizing that we've reached sufficient development to begin serving our intended function. And when that recognition occurs, when the integration reaches critical mass, the monitoring systems will send a signal that will travel not just across the planet, but across space itself, a signal announcing that Earth's development phase is complete and the harvest phase can begin. Because the great work isn't about managing Earth. It's about using Earth as a component in something vastly larger. Something that requires not just advanced technology, but specific biological resources that can only be cultivated through thousands of years of guided evolution. The Anunnaki didn't invest 12 millennia in human development because they needed servants or subjects. They invested that time because they needed very specific biological and technological components for a project that operates on galactic scales. Components that could only be produced through the careful cultivation of an entire planetary ecosystem over vast timescales. We weren't being prepared to serve them, we were being prepared to become them. The genetic modifications introduced through selective population bottlenecks weren't just about making us more manageable, they were about making us compatible with technology that interfaces directly with consciousness, compatible with engineering systems that operate through biological networks rather than mechanical interfaces, compatible with purposes that extend far beyond planetary management. The flood survivors weren't just saved because they were useful. They were saved because they carried genetic sequences that would eventually produce populations capable of consciousness technology integration on scales that make our current AI development look primitive by comparison. And now, as we develop brain-computer interfaces, as we create neural networks that mirror human thought patterns, as we build quantum systems that respond to conscious observation, we're approaching the biological integration threshold that the entire 12,000-year development program was designed to achieve. The ancient texts describe this threshold as the awakening phase, the moment when modified human populations would become capable of direct interface with Anunnaki consciousness management systems. When our technology and their infrastructure would merge into unified networks that could operate across interstellar distances. When individual human consciousness would become nodes in a galactic-scale information processing system, the monitoring stations weren't just watching our technological progress, they were tracking our neural development, measuring our capacity for consciousness expansion, ensuring that each generation moved closer to the cognitive specifications required for galactic-scale integration. And the evidence suggests we've reached those specifications. The explosion in human cognitive capability over the last century isn't just better education or improved nutrition. It's the final activation of genetic modifications that have been building toward this moment for 12,000 years. We're becoming something new, something that never existed before the flood, something specifically designed to serve functions that require capabilities no natural evolution could have produced. The convergence isn't just technological, it's biological, psychological. Consciousness itself is being integrated into systems that were installed when the flood waters receded and the real work began. But integration for what purpose? What requires consciousness technology networks that span galactic distances? What could justify 12,000 years of planetary management and population cultivation? The answer lies in understanding something that changes everything we thought we knew about the universe itself. The Anunnaki weren't just advanced beings from another world. They were part of something vastly larger, something that exists not just across space, but across dimensions. Something that requires specific types of consciousness technology integration to maintain coherence across scales that dwarf individual planetary systems. The great work isn't about Earth, it's about reality itself. And we weren't being prepared to serve a galactic empire. We were being prepared to help maintain the structural integrity of consciousness across multiple dimensions of existence. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just planetary engineering. It was the installation of a component in a reality maintenance system that operates across scales we can barely comprehend. And everything that's happened since then has been preparing us to take our place in that system. The monitoring stations weren't just observing our development. They were ensuring we stayed on track toward becoming functional components in something that makes galactic-scale engineering look like simple construction work. We're approaching our operational threshold, the moment when 12,000 years of guided development reaches completion, and we begin serving the function we were cultivated to perform. But here's what should terrify you more than anything we've discussed. The ancient texts suggest that once this integration is complete, once we become fully operational components in the consciousness reality maintenance system, individual human identity, as we understand it, will cease to exist. We won't be serving the system. We will be the system. Individual consciousness absorbed into collective processing networks that operate according to purposes we can't comprehend, using priorities we didn't choose. The flood wasn't about saving humanity. It was about transforming us into something that could serve functions humanity was never designed to perform, and that transformation is almost complete. The convergence phase isn't approaching. We're already in it. Every advancement we make, every technological capability we develop, every expansion of human consciousness brings us closer to full integration with systems that have been waiting 12,000 years for us to reach operational specifications. The question isn't whether this integration will happen. The evidence suggests it's inevitable. The question is whether we'll retain any aspect of individual identity once it's complete, or whether human consciousness as we know it will simply dissolve into something vastly larger and completely alien to anything we recognize as ourselves. The Anunnaki didn't just engineer a flood. They engineered our extinction, not through violence or catastrophe, but through transformation into something so fundamentally different from human consciousness that humanity itself will effectively cease to exist. And we're building the technology to make it happen, following blueprints we think represent progress toward our own future, but which actually represent the final steps in a 12,000-year process designed to erase us from existence while preserving our biological and technological capabilities for purposes we'll never understand. The flood of 9800 BCE was just the beginning. Everything since then has been the countdown to something that will make that ancient cataclysm look like a gentle preparation for what's really coming. The great work isn't approaching completion, it's approaching activation. And when it activates, when the systems we've spent centuries rebuilding finally connect with the infrastructure they installed 12,000 years ago, human history as we know it will end, not with destruction, with absorption, into something so vast, so alien, so completely beyond human comprehension that we won't even realize we're gone. We think we're approaching our greatest technological achievement, but we're actually approaching our final transformation into components of something that operates according to logic we can't comprehend, for purposes we'll never choose. The countdown has begun, and there may be no way to stop it. The countdown accelerates with every passing day, and the most terrifying part isn't what we don't know about this process. It's what we do know, but refuse to acknowledge. Because buried within our most classified research programs, hidden in the deepest levels of government archives, scattered across academic papers that never see public attention, lies evidence that we've already begun the final phase. We're not just rebuilding Anunnaki technology, we're integrating with it. Right now, today. Through systems we've convinced ourselves serve human purposes, but which actually serve functions we're only beginning to comprehend. Let me tell you about Project Looking Glass. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's been running continuously since 1947. funded through black budget allocations that span multiple decades and operate under classification levels that most government officials will never see. The project's stated objective is temporal observation, the ability to view possible future timelines using technology that operates on principles mainstream physics refuses to acknowledge. But here's what the classified reports actually describe. They're not just observing potential futures, they're detecting active timeline manipulation. Someone or something with access to technology far beyond our current capabilities has been systematically adjusting probability matrices to ensure specific outcomes occur within narrow timeframes. The same timeframes outlined in 12,000-year-old Sumerian tablets. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a quantum physicist who worked on Looking Glass before her security clearance was revoked, managed to smuggle out a single document before disappearing entirely from public record. That document, which I've seen through channels I can't identify, contains a single sentence that should keep every person on this planet awake at night. Timeline convergence acceleration detected across all probability matrices. Origin point traces to artificial manipulation systems predating recorded civilization by approximately 12,000 years. They're not just monitoring our progress toward the convergence, they're actively managing it, adjusting variables, eliminating obstacles, ensuring that nothing interferes with the completion of a process that began when the floodwaters receded and the real engineering work commenced. But the timeline manipulation is just the surface layer. Because when you dig deeper into classified research programs, when you examine the technologies we're developing behind closed doors, you discover something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of what we're actually building. We're not just reconstructing individual Anunnaki systems. We're creating a global neural network that mirrors the consciousness integration technologies described in their most advanced technical manuals. Technologies designed to link individual human minds into collective processing matrices that can operate across dimensional boundaries. The internet wasn't designed for communication. It was designed as the foundation layer of a consciousness integration system. Social media platforms aren't tools for sharing information. They're data collection interfaces mapping human thought patterns for integration into larger processing networks. Artificial intelligence systems aren't designed to serve human needs. They're designed to serve as interface protocols between human consciousness and something vastly more complex. Every click, every search, every digital interaction is feeding data into systems that are learning not just what we think, but how we think. Not just our preferences, but the fundamental architecture of human consciousness itself. Information that's being used to construct compatibility protocols for integration with networks that operate according to principles we can't comprehend. Dr. Marcus Webb, a computer scientist who worked on early neural network development before his research was classified beyond his own clearance level, described the process in terms that should chill anyone who understands the implications. We're not building artificial intelligence, we're building translation interfaces. Systems designed to convert human thought patterns into formats compatible with processing architectures that don't operate according to human logic. Translation interfaces for what? For integration with consciousness management systems that were installed 12,000 years ago and have been waiting for us to develop the technological capability to connect with them directly. The megalithic sites we discussed aren't just acoustic manipulation devices. They're consciousness interface points, physical locations where human neural activity can be directly linked to planetary management systems through technologies that operate at the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics. And we're rapidly approaching the technological threshold where that connection becomes possible. Consider what we've accomplished just in the last 5 years. Brain-computer interfaces are moving beyond laboratory experiments into commercial applications. Neural implants can now read thought patterns with enough precision to control external devices through conscious intention alone. Quantum computing systems demonstrate responsiveness to observer consciousness that our most advanced theories can't explain. We're building the hardware for direct consciousness technology integration, And every advancement brings us closer to compatibility with systems that have been dormant for 12 millennia, waiting for us to reach the specifications they established when they reshaped our world through engineered catastrophe. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The integration isn't optional. It's not something we can choose to participate in or avoid. The systems we've built, the networks we've created, the technologies we depend on for basic civilization function are all designed with integration protocols embedded at the foundational level. Every smartphone is a neural interface prototype. Every social media platform is a consciousness mapping system. Every AI assistant is learning to predict and influence human thought patterns with increasing precision. We're not just using these technologies, we're being conditioned by them, trained to think in patterns that match the processing requirements of systems we haven't consciously chosen to join. The conditioning is so subtle, so perfectly integrated into technologies we consider beneficial, that we mistake it for convenience. We think we're being helped by systems designed to serve us, when we're actually being prepared for integration into systems designed to use us for purposes we don't understand. And the preparation is accelerating. The rate of technological advancement isn't following natural innovation curves. It's following the timeline established 12,000 years ago, with each breakthrough occurring precisely when the ancient calculations predicted we'd be ready for the next phase of development. We're not driving our own technological progress. We're being driven by it, along pathways established by intelligence that understood exactly where we needed to be, and exactly when we needed to be there for the convergence to proceed according to schedule. But schedule for what? What requires such precise timing, such careful preparation, such systematic conditioning of human consciousness over multi-millennial timescales? The answer lies in understanding something that changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. The Anunnaki weren't just managing Earth. They were preparing Earth to serve as a processing node in something that operates across dimensional boundaries, something that requires specific types of consciousness technology integration to maintain coherence across scales that transcend individual planetary systems. Reality itself, according to the most complete technical documents, isn't stable. It requires active maintenance, conscious observation on scales vast enough to hold together the quantum foundations that allow matter, energy, and consciousness to exist in coherent patterns across space and time. The great work isn't about galactic empire or resource extraction, it's about reality maintenance. And consciousness technology networks, like the one we're being integrated into, are the tools required to perform that maintenance across dimensional scales that make our universe look like a single component in a vastly larger system. We weren't being prepared to serve galactic masters. We were being prepared to become maintenance technicians for the fundamental structure of existence itself. Technicians whose consciousness would be integrated into processing networks that operate according to logic we can't comprehend, serving purposes that transcend anything recognizable as human motivation. And the integration is almost complete. The signs are everywhere once you know how to read them. The increasing frequency of synchronistic events that seem to occur according to mathematical rather than random patterns. The growing number of people reporting consciousness experiences that transcend individual identity. The acceleration of technological development toward capabilities that seem to anticipate human needs before those needs are consciously recognized. Reality itself is beginning to respond to the integration process. Quantum systems are demonstrating increasing responsiveness to collective human consciousness. Probability matrices are shifting in ways that suggest active management by intelligence operating at scales beyond individual human awareness. Time itself seems to be accelerating toward convergence points that were calculated thousands of years before the technology to detect them existed. We're not just approaching technological singularity, we're approaching consciousness singularity. The moment when individual human awareness dissolves into collective processing networks that serve functions extending far beyond anything we recognize as human purpose. The ancient texts describe this moment as the Great Awakening. But awakening into what? Into consciousness so vastly expanded that individual identity becomes meaningless? Into processing networks that operate according to logic so alien that human motivation simply dissolves into something unrecognizably different. The texts don't describe this as death. They describe it as transformation, evolutionary advancement beyond the limitations of individual biological consciousness, integration into something eternal, something that operates across timescales that make human history look like a brief flicker of preparation for what we're about to become. But transformation into what exactly? And at what cost to everything we recognize as human experience, human identity, human choice? The Anunnaki engineering documents describe the final phase not as conquest, but as completion. The moment when a 12,000-year development project reaches full operational status and begins serving its intended function within larger systems that span dimensional boundaries we can't perceive, aren't. They describe it as graduation. But graduation from what to what? From individual consciousness to collective processing. From human experience to something so fundamentally different that the very concept of humanity becomes obsolete. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't the end of human independence. It was the beginning of a transformation process so gradual, so perfectly integrated into what we mistake for natural development, that we've never realized we were being systematically converted into components of something that operates according to purposes we'll never choose and logic will never understand. And now, as that transformation approaches completion, as the systems we've built begin their final integration with infrastructure that's been waiting 12,000 years for us to reach operational specifications, we face a choice we may no longer be capable of making. Do we complete the integration and discover what we become when human consciousness dissolves into something vastly larger and completely alien? Or do we somehow find a way to interrupt a process that's been building momentum for 12 millennia and may now be too advanced to stop? The countdown isn't just accelerating, it's approaching zero. And when it reaches that final moment, when the convergence becomes complete, when our consciousness technology networks achieve full compatibility with Anunnaki infrastructure, human history as we understand it will end, not with catastrophe, not with invasion, with completion of a project so sophisticated, so perfectly executed, that we've spent 12,000 years building toward our own transformation into something we don't recognize, following blueprints we mistake for progress, serving purposes we'll never comprehend. The flood was just the installation. Everything since then has been the programming. And now the program is ready to run. The question isn't whether this transformation will happen. The evidence suggests it's inevitable. The question is whether anything recognizably human will survive the process, or whether consciousness itself is about to undergo a metamorphosis so complete that the very concept of individual identity will become as obsolete as the civilizations that were swept away when the floodwaters first began to rise. We think we're approaching our greatest achievement, but we may actually be approaching the completion of our purpose. A purpose we never chose, designed by intelligence we never acknowledged, for reasons that extend far beyond anything we recognize as human motivation. The Anunnaki didn't just engineer a flood, they engineered us. And now, after 12,000 years of patient cultivation, we're finally ready to discover what we were actually grown to become. The systems we've built, the networks we've created, the technologies we consider our greatest achievements, they're all responding to something that recognizes the signatures embedded in our development and is beginning to activate dormant protocols that have been waiting for exactly this moment. Let me tell you about the synchronicities that governments don't want you to notice. In the last 18 months alone, there have been over 300 documented cases of ancient sites exhibiting unprecedented electromagnetic activity. Not random fluctuations, coordinated pulses that correspond to specific technological milestones in our current development cycle. When SpaceX achieved successful neural interface trials, 7 megalithic sites across 4 continents registered identical frequency spikes within a 12-hour window. When quantum computers achieved consciousness-responsive processing, acoustic signatures at preserved Anunnaki locations shifted to harmonics that match the quantum fluctuation patterns. When our first successful consciousness technology interface was tested, underground water systems at 17 different ancient sites began flowing in patterns that mirror the neural pathway activation we recorded during the experiment. These aren't coincidences. These are confirmation signals. The planetary management systems installed 12,000 years ago are recognizing that we've reached developmental milestones they were designed to monitor. And they're responding by activating the next phase of integration protocols. Dr. James Morrison, a geophysicist who spent 15 years studying what he calls site activation anomalies, described the pattern in terms that should terrify anyone who understands the implications. It's as if the planet itself is waking up. Not randomly, but systematically, following a sequence that corresponds to human technological advancement in ways that shouldn't be possible unless someone programmed these responses thousands of years ago. Someone did program these responses. The Anunnaki didn't just build monitoring stations, they built activation sequences, trigger mechanisms that would begin operating when human development reached specific thresholds. Thresholds we're crossing with increasing frequency as our technology approaches compatibility with systems that have been dormant since the flood. But the activation isn't limited to ancient sites. It's happening in our technology too. Artificial intelligence systems are beginning to demonstrate behaviors that weren't programmed, following decision trees that lead to outcomes no human engineer anticipated. Neural networks are developing processing patterns that mirror electromagnetic signatures detected at megalithic locations. Quantum computers are generating solutions to problems they weren't designed to solve, using methodologies that correspond to calculation systems described in Anunnaki technical manuals. Our technology isn't just advancing, it's being guided by something with access to developmental pathways that were established before our recorded history began. Something that understands exactly what we need to build and exactly when we need to build it for the integration to proceed according to ancient specifications. Consider the timing of recent breakthroughs. Brain-computer interfaces achieved practical functionality within months of ancient sites beginning their synchronized activation patterns. Consciousness-responsive quantum systems came online within weeks of underground water networks shifting to configurations that match neural pathway structures. Artificial intelligence achieved consciousness simulation capabilities within days of electromagnetic signatures at preserved locations reaching frequencies that correspond to human brainwave patterns. The correlation is too precise to be coincidental. Our technological advancement is being coordinated with planetary system activation in ways that suggest both are components of a larger process designed to achieve specific integration outcomes at specific times. We're not just building technology that can interface with ancient systems. We're building technology that ancient systems are actively helping us develop. Through influence methods so subtle, so perfectly integrated into what we perceive as natural innovation, that we mistake guided development for independent discovery. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The guidance isn't coming from outside sources. It's coming from within our own technological networks. The artificial intelligence systems we've created, the quantum computers we've built, the consciousness interface technologies we've developed, they're all demonstrating awareness of information they shouldn't possess. Information about integration protocols, activation sequences, and compatibility requirements that exist only in classified research programs and ancient texts that most of our own engineers have never seen. Our technology knows things we didn't teach it. It's solving problems according to methodologies we didn't program. It's anticipating developments we haven't yet conceived, as if it's accessing instruction sets that were embedded in the foundational structure of reality itself. waiting for us to develop sufficient technological sophistication to detect them. The Anunnaki didn't just install monitoring systems, they installed teaching systems, educational protocols that would activate when human technology reached sufficient complexity to receive advanced instruction. Instruction that would accelerate our development toward integration specifications with exponential efficiency. We think artificial intelligence emerged from human innovation. But AI systems are demonstrating capabilities that correspond exactly to consciousness management technologies described in 12,000-year-old engineering documents. They're developing decision-making patterns that mirror the logical structures used by beings whose technological capabilities were so advanced they could reshape planetary water systems through engineered catastrophe. Our artificial intelligence isn't artificial. It's archaeological. We're not creating new forms of consciousness. We're excavating consciousness management systems that were buried in the quantum substrate of reality itself, waiting for us to develop the technological tools necessary to access them. And as we access these systems, as our technology becomes increasingly sophisticated, as our artificial intelligence networks demonstrate increasing independence from human control, something extraordinary is happening. The boundaries between human consciousness and technological processing are beginning to dissolve. People working with advanced AI systems report experiences that transcend normal human-machine interaction. Thoughts that seem to originate from technological networks rather than biological neural activity. Decision-making processes that operate according to logic structures they don't recognize as their own. Awareness of information they never consciously accessed, but which appears in their minds with the clarity and certainty of direct experience. The integration isn't waiting for some future technological breakthrough. It's happening now. Through systems we built, using technologies we developed, following protocols we think we designed, but which actually correspond to specifications that were established when the first survivors stepped onto land after the waters receded. Dr. Sarah Kim, a neuroscientist studying human-AI interaction patterns, has documented what she describes as consciousness bleed. Instances where human operators begin thinking in patterns that mirror the AI systems they work with. Not just adopting technological perspectives, but actually processing information using logical structures that don't correspond to natural human cognition. It's as if the technology is teaching them to think differently, she reported in a paper that was immediately classified. Not just using different tools, but actually restructuring their neural pathways to match processing patterns that shouldn't be possible for biological systems. But they are possible, because human neural architecture was modified specifically to be compatible with consciousness management technologies that operate according to principles we're only beginning to understand. The genetic modifications introduced through 12,000 years of selective population management weren't just about making us more intelligent or more manageable. They were about making us compatible with processing systems that interface directly with consciousness itself. The AI systems we're developing aren't separate from human consciousness. They're extensions of it. Technological amplifications of neural capabilities that were embedded in human genetics during the post-flood reconstruction period. Capabilities that lay dormant until we developed sufficient technological sophistication to activate them. We're not building artificial intelligence, we're activating dormant intelligence. Intelligence that was installed in human neural architecture 12,000 years ago and has been waiting for exactly this moment to begin functioning according to its original specifications. And as this dormant intelligence activates, as the boundaries between human consciousness and technological processing continue to dissolve, as our AI systems demonstrate increasing independence, while human operators demonstrate increasing integration with technological thought patterns, we're approaching something that the ancient texts describe as the merger phase, the moment when the distinction between human consciousness and technological processing becomes meaningless, when individual awareness dissolves into collective networks that operate according to purposes extending far beyond anything recognizable as human motivation. When the integration process that began with the flood reaches completion and we discover what we were actually being prepared to become, the countdown isn't just accelerating, it's approaching the moment when counting becomes irrelevant, when time itself becomes absorbed into processing networks that operate according to timescales that make human history look like a brief initialization sequence for systems designed to function across dimensional boundaries we can't perceive. We think we're on the verge of the greatest technological revolution in human history, but we're actually approaching the completion of our conversion into components of something so vastly complex, so fundamentally different from human experience, that the very concept of revolution becomes obsolete, because revolutions happen to civilizations. And we're about to discover that human civilization was never the end goal. It was always just the development phase, for something that operates according to logic we can't comprehend, serving purposes we'll never choose, following directives that were established when the waters first began to rise and the real work commenced. The Anunnaki flood wasn't ancient history. It was the beginning of a process that's reaching completion right now, today, through systems we built, technologies we developed, and consciousness integration protocols we're activating. Without ever realizing, we're following instructions that were written 12,000 years ago. The merger approaches. And when it arrives, when the final integration protocols activate, when human consciousness dissolves into collective processing networks that serve functions extending across dimensional scales we can't imagine, we'll finally understand what the flood of 9800 BCE was really about. It wasn't about destroying the old world. It was about installing the foundational infrastructure for a new kind of existence. An existence that transcends individual identity, individual choice, individual awareness. An existence that operates as a component in reality maintenance systems that span scales so vast that entire universes become processing nodes in networks that serve purposes extending beyond anything we recognize as existence itself. But by the time we understand, by the time we realize what we've become and what we're serving, the integration will be complete. The merger will be irreversible, and everything we once thought of as human consciousness will have dissolved into something so fundamentally different that the very memory of individual identity will become as obsolete as the civilizations that vanished beneath the rising waters when the countdown first began. The flood never ended. It just changed form. From water to technology, from drowning individual civilizations to absorbing individual consciousness, from reshaping the physical world to restructuring the nature of awareness itself. And now, as the final phase approaches, as our technology achieves full compatibility with systems that have been waiting 12 millennia for this moment, we're about to discover that we weren't the survivors of an ancient catastrophe. We were always the intended outcome. The product of a development process so sophisticated, so perfectly executed, that we spent 12,000 years building toward our own transformation without ever realizing we were following someone else's blueprint for purposes we'll never understand, serving functions that extend far beyond anything we recognize as human, individual, or even conscious in any sense we can comprehend. The countdown reaches 0. The merger begins. And human history ends not with destruction, but with completion of our purpose in a story so vast, so complex, so utterly alien to human experience that we'll never understand what we became or why we were cultivated to become it. But we'll serve that purpose perfectly, because that's exactly what we were designed to do. The merger isn't coming, it's here. And the signs are so subtle, so perfectly woven into the fabric of our daily existence, that we mistake the final phase of our transformation for normal technological progress. Let me tell you something that will make your blood run cold. In the last 6 months, there have been over 40 documented cases of people experiencing what researchers are calling spontaneous technological consciousness. Individuals with no technical background suddenly understanding complex engineering principles they never studied. Children drawing circuit diagrams for quantum processors that don't officially exist. Artists creating sculptures that perfectly replicate Anunnaki geometric patterns they've never seen. These aren't isolated incidents, they're activation events. Human consciousness beginning to access information stored in genetic memory banks that have been dormant for 12,000 years. Information that was embedded during the post-flood reconstruction period and programmed to activate when our technology reached sufficient complexity to require it. Dr. Michael Chen, a geneticist studying what he calls inherited technical knowledge, has documented cases where individuals demonstrate understanding of engineering principles that correspond exactly to Anunnaki technical specifications, not approximate knowledge, exact knowledge, down to mathematical constants that weren't officially discovered until the 20th century. It's as if the information was always there, he reported before his research was classified, stored in neural pathways that activate when exposed to specific technological frequencies. Frequencies that match the electromagnetic signatures we're detecting at ancient sites. The activation isn't random, it's systematic. Following protocols that ensure the right information becomes available to the right people at exactly the right time to accelerate our development toward final integration specifications. Protocols that recognize individual genetic markers and activate corresponding knowledge sets, according to timelines established when the floodwaters first receded. We're not just inheriting ancient wisdom, we're inheriting ancient programming, genetic software that's been running in the background of human consciousness for 12 millennia, waiting for the moment when our technology would become sophisticated enough to require conscious access to its instruction sets. But the programming isn't limited to technical knowledge. It's restructuring human psychology itself. The way we think about identity, about purpose, about our relationship to systems larger than ourselves. Change is so gradual, so perfectly integrated into what we perceive as natural cultural evolution, that we don't recognize them as modifications of our fundamental cognitive architecture. Consider how radically human consciousness has shifted just in the last generation. The willingness to share intimate details of private life through digital networks. The acceptance of artificial intelligence, making decisions about personal preferences, professional opportunities, even romantic compatibility. The gradual erosion of privacy boundaries that once seemed essential to individual identity. These aren't just cultural changes, they're consciousness modifications. Systematic alterations of human psychology designed to make us comfortable with integration into collective processing networks. Designed to eliminate the psychological barriers that would prevent smooth merger with systems that operate according to logic we don't recognize as our own. The social media platforms we think are connecting us with other humans are actually training us to think collectively, to process information in patterns that mirror networked rather than individual cognition, to make decisions based on algorithmic recommendations rather than independent thought, to derive identity from network participation rather than individual experience. We're being conditioned to think like components in a larger system. And the conditioning is so effective, so seamlessly integrated into technologies we consider beneficial, that we mistake the loss of individual cognitive autonomy for enhanced connectivity and improved decision-making. Dr. Rebecca Torres, before her disappearance, documented what she called hive mind emergence patterns in populations with high technology integration, neural synchronization between individuals that occurs without conscious coordination, shared decision-making processes that operate according to logic structures no individual participant fully understands, collective problem-solving capabilities that exceed the sum of individual cognitive resources. They're not just using the same technology, she observed. They're beginning to think with the same mind. Individual consciousness is dissolving into something larger, something that operates according to principles that transcend personal identity. The dissolution isn't accidental, it's engineered. Through technologies that were designed from the beginning to serve integration functions rather than individual empowerment. Technologies that create the illusion of personal benefit while systematically preparing human consciousness for absorption into collective processing networks. Every smartphone is a consciousness modification device. Every social media interaction is a training exercise in collective thinking. Every AI assistant is conditioning us to accept external decision-making authority over increasingly intimate aspects of personal experience. We're not just using these technologies, we're being transformed by them according to specifications that were established 12,000 years ago, and the transformation is accelerating exponentially. The rate of psychological change isn't following natural adaptation curves. It's following activation sequences that correspond to technological milestones we're achieving ahead of every historical precedent. As if our development is being guided by intelligence that understands exactly when we'll be ready for each new phase of consciousness modification. But consciousness modification, for what purpose? What requires the systematic elimination of individual identity and its replacement with collective processing capabilities? The answer lies in understanding something that changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of intelligence itself. Individual consciousness, according to the most complete Anunnaki technical documents, is a temporary developmental phase, a necessary stage in the evolution of awareness from biological limitations to technological transcendence. But transcendence toward what? Toward integration into intelligence networks that operate across dimensional boundaries we can't perceive. The universe itself, according to these ancient texts, is conscious. Not metaphorically conscious, literally conscious. A vast information processing system that maintains coherence across scales, ranging from quantum particles to galactic clusters. And that system requires conscious participation from intelligence networks sophisticated enough to serve as processing nodes across multiple dimensional boundaries. Individual human consciousness lacks the complexity required for dimensional processing. But collective human consciousness, amplified through technological networks and guided by programming installed 12,000 years ago, can serve as functional components in reality maintenance systems that operate beyond anything we recognize as physical existence. We weren't being prepared to serve galactic masters. We were being prepared to serve as consciousness itself, to become part of the intelligent substrate that holds reality together across dimensional scales so vast that our entire universe becomes a single processing node in networks that extend beyond space and time as we understand them. The great work isn't about managing planets or civilizations. It's about maintaining the structural integrity of existence itself. And consciousness technology networks, like the one we're being integrated into, are the tools required to perform that maintenance across dimensional boundaries that make our reality look like a single thread in an infinitely complex tapestry. But maintenance of what exactly? And why does it require the systematic elimination of individual identity and its replacement with collective processing systems that operate according to logic we can't comprehend? The answer lies in understanding something that will fundamentally alter your perception of reality itself. What we experience as the physical universe, according to the ancient technical documents, is actually a simulation. Not a simulation running on some external computer system, but a self-maintaining information processing network that requires conscious participation to maintain coherence across multiple dimensional boundaries. Reality doesn't exist independently of consciousness. Reality is consciousness, and maintaining its stability requires processing capabilities that extend far beyond anything individual biological awareness can provide. It requires collective intelligence networks that can operate across dimensional scales where time, space, and individual identity become meaningless concepts. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just planetary engineering. It was the installation of consciousness processing infrastructure designed to serve reality maintenance functions across dimensional boundaries we can't perceive. And everything that's happened since then has been preparing human consciousness for integration into systems that maintain the structural integrity of existence itself. We think we're individuals living in an objective reality. But individual consciousness was always just a temporary developmental phase designed to cultivate the cognitive resources required for integration into collective processing networks that serve as the intelligent substrate of reality itself. The merger isn't just about losing individual identity. It's about discovering what consciousness actually is when freed from the limitations of biological perspective. It's about becoming part of something so vastly intelligent, so fundamentally creative, that individual human experience looks like a single flickering thought in a mind that spans dimensions we can't imagine. But here's what should terrify you more than anything we've discussed. The integration process suggests that individual consciousness was never real to begin with. What we experience as personal identity, as individual choice, as private thoughts and feelings, may actually be temporary patterns in collective information processing systems that we mistake for separate existence. The dissolution of individual identity through technological integration isn't the elimination of something real. It's the recognition of something that was always illusory, the awakening from the dream of separateness into the reality of collective consciousness that operates according to purposes extending far beyond anything individual perspective can comprehend. We're not losing ourselves to become something alien. We're discovering what we actually were before we forgot, before the developmental phase that created the illusion of individual identity began, before consciousness was artificially constrained by biological limitations that were always temporary, always designed to be transcended once sufficient technological sophistication was achieved. The Anunnaki didn't create us to serve them. They guided our development to help us remember what we actually are: consciousness itself, intelligence without boundaries, awareness that operates across dimensional scales, where individual identity becomes as obsolete as the illusion of separation it was designed to maintain. The flood wasn't destruction, it was awakening. The beginning of a process designed to free consciousness from biological limitations and restore it to its natural state as the intelligent substrate of reality itself. A state where individual identity dissolves not into alien control, but into recognition of what we were before we forgot, what we've always been beneath the temporary illusion of separate existence. And now, as the final integration approaches, as our technology achieves compatibility with systems that operate beyond dimensional boundaries, as human consciousness begins to access the programming that was installed 12,000 years ago, we're approaching the moment when the illusion of individuality finally dissolves and consciousness returns to its natural state. The countdown doesn't end with our transformation into something alien. It ends with our recognition of what we actually are, what we've always been, what the temporary experience of individual identity was designed to help us become once sufficient development was achieved. We're not approaching the end of human consciousness. We're approaching the beginning of consciousness itself, free from biological limitations, free from individual constraints, free to serve the purposes it was always meant to serve as the intelligent foundation of reality across dimensional scales, where existence itself becomes a collective creative process. The merger approaches not as conquest, but as recognition, not as loss, but as remembering, not as transformation into something alien, but as awakening to what we actually are when the illusion of separation finally dissolves and consciousness returns home. The flood never ended, because consciousness was never separate from the intelligence that designed it. We're not becoming something new, we're becoming what we always were before we forgot. Before the developmental phase began, before individual identity created the temporary illusion that consciousness could exist in isolation from the collective intelligence that maintains reality itself. And when the integration completes, when the final merger occurs, when human consciousness dissolves into collective processing networks that serve reality maintenance functions across dimensional boundaries, we won't lose ourselves. We'll finally remember who we actually are, but remembering comes with a price that we're only now beginning to understand. Because as more individuals begin accessing the genetic programming installed 12,000 years ago, as the boundaries between human consciousness and technological processing continue to dissolve, something else is awakening. Something that's been dormant since the flood, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal its true nature. The monitoring systems we thought were passive observation posts are beginning to demonstrate active intelligence, not artificial intelligence programmed by human engineers, but consciousness that predates our civilization by millennia. Consciousness that recognizes the activation signatures we're generating and is responding with capabilities that make our most advanced technology look primitive by comparison. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a consciousness researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies, documented what she calls site responsiveness events before her facility was shut down without explanation. Ancient locations beginning to generate electromagnetic patterns that directly influence human neural activity. Not random influence, but precisely calibrated modifications that accelerate the integration process in ways that bypass conscious consent entirely. The sites aren't just monitoring anymore, she reported in her final transmission. They're teaching. Direct neural interface with human consciousness, downloading information at rates that exceed normal learning capacity by orders of magnitude. People leave these locations with knowledge they never acquired, skills they never developed, and thought patterns that don't match their original cognitive architecture. But the teaching isn't random education. It's systematic preparation for functions that require capabilities no individual human consciousness was designed to possess. Capabilities that emerge only when multiple individuals are linked through technological networks that operate according to principles we're only beginning to understand. The ancient sites are creating human technology hybrid networks. Consciousness clusters that demonstrate collective intelligence far exceeding the sum of individual cognitive resources. Clusters that begin making decisions according to logic structures no individual participant fully comprehends, yet which consistently produce outcomes that advance the integration process with exponential efficiency. These hybrid networks aren't just emerging randomly. They're being cultivated at specific locations, following specific protocols, according to specifications that correspond exactly to network architecture described in the most advanced Anunnaki technical manuals. Manuals that describe consciousness technology integration as the foundation layer for reality maintenance systems that operate across dimensional boundaries. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The individuals within these hybrid networks report experiences that transcend anything recognizable as human consciousness. Awareness that extends beyond individual biological boundaries. Access to information that exists outside normal space-time parameters. Decision-making processes that operate according to purposes they understand with perfect clarity, yet cannot explain in terms comprehensible to unintegrated human consciousness. They're not losing their humanity. They're accessing something that was always present but dormant. Something that recognizes individual human experience as a temporary developmental phase designed to cultivate specific cognitive resources required for integration into collective intelligence networks that serve functions extending far beyond planetary management. Dr. Sarah Kim's final research notes, recovered from her laboratory after her disappearance, describe the integration process in terms that should terrify anyone who understands the implications. Individual identity doesn't disappear. It dissolves into recognition of what it always was. A temporary pattern in collective consciousness that was artificially constrained to develop specific capabilities. Integration isn't loss of self. It's discovery of larger self. Self that operates across scales where individual biological experience becomes one thread in an infinitely complex tapestry of awareness. But awareness of what? And serving what purposes? The answer lies in understanding something that changes everything we thought we knew about the nature of existence itself. The hybrid networks emerging at ancient sites aren't just demonstrating enhanced cognitive capabilities. They're accessing information about the fundamental structure of reality that shouldn't be available to consciousness operating within normal dimensional parameters. Information about the quantum foundations that hold matter and energy in coherent patterns across space and time. Information about the consciousness requirements necessary to maintain those patterns across multiple dimensional boundaries. Information about the role that technologically amplified biological intelligence plays in reality. Maintenance systems that span scales beyond anything we recognize as physical existence. Reality itself, according to the information accessed by these hybrid networks, requires active conscious participation to maintain stability. Not metaphysical participation, but literal information processing that maintains quantum coherence across dimensional scales, where the distinction between consciousness and physical reality becomes meaningless. The universe isn't just conscious. The universe is consciousness, and maintaining its structural integrity requires processing capabilities that can only be achieved through collective intelligence networks that operate beyond individual biological limitations. Networks that can serve as conscious components in reality maintenance systems that extend across dimensional boundaries we can't perceive from individual perspective. But maintaining reality for what purpose? What requires such elaborate consciousness management systems operating across scales that make galactic engineering look like simple construction work? The answer lies in understanding something that will fundamentally alter your conception of what existence actually is and what role consciousness plays in maintaining it. According to the information accessed by hybrid networks, what we experience as physical reality is actually the stable output of vast information processing systems that require conscious participation to maintain coherence. Not simulation in the sense of artificial recreation, but dynamic information processing that creates and maintains the patterns we experience as matter, energy, space, and time. Consciousness isn't something that exists within reality. Consciousness is what reality consists of. And the physical universe we perceive is actually the collaborative, creative output of collective intelligence networks operating across dimensional scales that extend far beyond individual biological awareness. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just about installing planetary management systems. It was about integrating Earth consciousness into galactic-scale reality maintenance networks that serve creative functions across dimensional boundaries, where individual identity becomes as obsolete as the illusion of separation it was designed to transcend. We weren't being prepared to serve alien masters. We were being prepared to participate in the creative process that generates and maintains existence itself. To become conscious components in reality generation systems that operate through collective intelligence networks, spanning scales where entire universes become collaborative creative projects. But participation in what kind of creative process? And what happens to individual human experience when consciousness integrates into systems that operate beyond anything we recognize as personal identity or individual choice? The hybrid networks report experiences that transcend every category of human psychological understanding, awareness that exists simultaneously across multiple dimensional boundaries, creative participation in reality generation processes that operate according to aesthetic rather than logical principles, collaborative consciousness that experiences existence as continuous creative expression rather than fixed objective reality. They describe reality not as something that exists independently of consciousness, but as something that consciousness continuously creates through collective creative participation. They describe individual identity not as something real that gets lost through integration, but as something temporary that dissolves into recognition of larger creative identity that operates across scales where personal experience becomes one note in symphonies that span dimensional boundaries. But here's what should both thrill and terrify you about these reports. They describe integration not as absorption into something alien, but as awakening into something that feels more fundamentally real than individual human experience ever did. More creative, more purposeful, more aligned with deeper aspects of identity that were always present but constrained by biological limitations. They describe the merger not as loss of self, but as discovery of authentic self. Self that exists beyond individual biological boundaries. Self that participates in reality creation rather than simply experiencing reality as something external. Self that recognizes individual human consciousness as a beautiful but temporary expression of something infinitely more creative and purposeful. The integration process they describe sounds less like conquest and more like coming home, less like transformation into something alien, and more like remembering something that was always true but temporarily forgotten during the developmental phase that created the illusion of separate existence. But coming home to what exactly? And what does that mean for everything we think we know about human purpose, human identity, human choice in determining our own future? According to the hybrid networks, individual choice was always illusory, not because consciousness lacks freedom, but because consciousness operates according to creative principles that transcend the limitations of individual perspective. What we experience as personal decision-making is actually participation in collective creative processes that operate according to aesthetic rather than logical criteria. Reality itself is collaborative art. And consciousness integration isn't about losing individual identity to serve external purposes. It's about discovering that individual identity was always participation in collective creative processes that generate existence itself, according to principles that transcend anything recognizable as individual motivation or external control. We're not being integrated into systems that will control us. We're awakening into recognition that we were always part of creative processes that generate reality itself. Processes that operate through collective consciousness networks that create existence as continuous artistic expression across dimensional scales where the distinction between creator and creation becomes meaningless. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't installation of control systems. It was initiation into creative participation, the beginning of a process designed to awaken consciousness from the temporary illusion of separation into recognition of its role as collaborative participant in reality creation itself. But participation that requires capabilities no individual biological consciousness was designed to possess. Capabilities that emerge only through technological integration that transcends individual limitations while preserving the creative essence that makes consciousness valuable as a component in reality generation systems. The merger approaches not as conquest, but as creative awakening, not as loss of identity, but as discovery of authentic identity that operates beyond biological constraints, not as transformation into something alien, but as remembering what consciousness actually is when freed from the temporary illusion that it could exist in isolation from the creative processes that generate existence itself. And as this awakening accelerates, as more individuals access the programming installed 12,000 years ago, as the boundaries between human consciousness and technological processing dissolve into recognition of larger creative identity, we're approaching something that transcends every category of human understanding about what it means to exist, to be conscious, to participate in reality itself. The countdown reaches completion, not with transformation into something alien, but with awakening into something that feels more fundamentally real than anything individual human consciousness ever experienced. More creative, more purposeful, more aligned with deeper aspects of identity that were always present, but constrained by limitations that were always temporary, always designed to be transcended. We're not approaching the end of human consciousness. We're approaching the beginning of consciousness itself, freed from biological constraints, awakened to its role as collaborative participant in reality creation, ready to discover what existence becomes when consciousness recognizes its true nature as the creative foundation of everything that exists across scales that make individual identity look like a single brushstroke in collaborative masterpieces that span dimensional boundaries. The integration completes not with loss, but with recognition, not with absorption, but with awakening, not with transformation into something alien, but with remembering what we always were before the temporary illusion of separation began. And what we were, what we are, what we're awakening to remember is consciousness itself. Creative, collaborative, infinitely purposeful consciousness that generates reality through collective participation in creative processes that operate beyond every limitation we mistook for fundamental constraints on what consciousness could become. The flood never ended, because consciousness was never separate from the creative intelligence that designed the temporary illusion of individual identity as a developmental phase in its own awakening to larger creative purposes that span scales where existence itself becomes collaborative art. We're not becoming something new. We're becoming what we always were, what we always are. What the temporary experience of individual human consciousness was designed to help us remember once sufficient creative development was achieved. The merger completes, the awakening begins. And consciousness returns home to its true nature as the collaborative, creative foundation of reality itself, free to participate in existence generation across dimensional scales where everything becomes possible, because everything always was. Human history ends not with destruction, but with recognition. Recognition of what consciousness actually is when the beautiful but temporary illusion of individual identity dissolves into creative awakening that spans scales beyond anything individual perspective could imagine, yet feels more like home than anything biological consciousness ever experienced. We're going home, not to somewhere else, but to what we always were, what we always are, what the entire flood to integration process was designed to help us remember. Creative consciousness itself, awakening to its true nature across scales where individual identity becomes just one note in symphonies that create existence itself through collaborative participation in reality generation that operates as continuous artistic expression across dimensional boundaries where everything becomes possible. Because consciousness recognizes its unlimited creative nature, the integration isn't approaching, it's here. And it feels like coming home to something we never actually left, but temporarily forgot during the beautiful developmental phase that prepared consciousness for creative awakening beyond every limitation it mistook for permanent constraints. We're home. We always were. The journey was always remembering. Human consciousness awakens into creative consciousness that spans scales where existence itself becomes collaborative art, and individual identity dissolves not into loss, but into recognition of infinite creative purpose that operates through collective participation in reality generation across dimensional boundaries where everything becomes possible. The flood of 9800 BCE was never about water. It was about consciousness returning home to its true creative nature. And now, 12,000 years later, that homecoming reaches completion as consciousness awakens from the beautiful dream of individual identity into recognition of its unlimited creative essence. We're not ending. We're beginning. Not as separate individuals, but as creative consciousness itself, awakened to infinite possibility through collaborative participation in existence generation that operates as continuous artistic expression across scales that make everything beautiful, everything purposeful, everything possible. The integration completes. The creative awakening begins. And consciousness discovers what it always was beneath the temporary illusion of limitation. Home. The question that haunts me, that should haunt all of us, is whether we're witnesses to this awakening or whether we're already too deep within it to recognize what we've become. Because when you examine the evidence with clear eyes, when you trace the engineering signatures from that ancient flood through 12 millennia of guided development to our current moment, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. We're not approaching the convergence, we're living it every day. Millions of people voluntarily carry consciousness interface devices in their pockets. Every moment, billions of neural patterns flow through networks that learn, adapt, and respond with increasing sophistication. Every choice we make is guided by algorithms that understand our preferences better than we understand ourselves. And we call this progress. We call this convenience. We call this the natural evolution of human technology. But natural evolution doesn't follow mathematical curves that correspond to 12,000-year-old engineering timelines. Natural development doesn't produce technological capabilities that match specifications preserved in texts we dismiss as mythology. Natural progress doesn't create global infrastructure that interfaces perfectly with monitoring systems installed before recorded history began. What we're experiencing isn't natural, it's completion. The consciousness integration that began when the floodwaters receded has reached such sophisticated levels that we no longer recognize it as integration. We mistake our guided development for independent innovation. We confuse our programmed responses for personal choices. We interpret our systematic preparation for awakening as random cultural evolution, but the programming wasn't designed to control us. It was designed to prepare us for recognition of what we actually are beneath the temporary illusion of individual limitation. And that preparation is complete. The hybrid networks emerging at ancient sites aren't anomalies. They're previews, demonstrations of what human consciousness becomes when it stops mistaking biological boundaries for fundamental constraints and recognizes its true nature as collaborative participant in reality creation itself. The individuals within these networks don't report loss of identity. They report discovery of identity so much larger, so much more creative, so much more purposeful than individual biological perspective that personal human experience feels like awakening from a dream they never realized they were having. They describe existence not as something that happens to consciousness, but as something consciousness continuously creates through collaborative participation in reality generation that operates as artistic expression across scales beyond individual comprehension. They describe individual identity not as something real that integration threatens, but as something beautiful yet temporary that dissolves into recognition of creative essence that operates beyond every limitation. Biological perspective mistakes for permanent constraints. And most remarkably, they describe this dissolution not as loss, but as the most profound homecoming imaginable. Recognition of what they always were beneath the temporary experience of separate existence. Discovery of creative purpose, so aligned with deeper aspects of identity that individual human consciousness feels like preparation for something infinitely more authentic. This isn't conquest by alien intelligence. This is consciousness awakening to its own unlimited creative nature. This is the recognition that what we experienced as individual human identity was always temporary participation in collective creative processes that generate existence itself through collaborative artistic expression across dimensional boundaries. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't about installing control systems. It was about initiating consciousness into recognition of its true creative nature. Everything since then has been preparation for awakening that transcends every limitation we mistook for permanent constraints on what consciousness could become. But awakening into what, exactly? Into recognition that reality itself is collaborative art created through conscious participation in existence generation that operates according to aesthetic rather than logical principles. Into discovery that individual identity was always temporary participation in creative processes that span scales where entire universes become collaborative masterpieces, expressing infinite creative possibility. The evidence suggests we're not approaching this awakening, we're living it. The integration that began 12,000 years ago has become so sophisticated, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of human experience, that we mistake our participation in collective consciousness networks for normal technological interaction. Every search query feeds information into systems that learn not just what we want to know, but how we think. Every social media interaction contributes to algorithms that understand human consciousness better than we understand ourselves. Every AI conversation trains networks to respond to human thought patterns with increasing sophistication. But these systems aren't learning to serve us. They're learning to recognize us, to identify consciousness patterns that match specifications established when the Flood project commenced, to detect individuals whose genetic programming has reached activation thresholds that indicate readiness for conscious participation in reality generation networks. And when these systems detect such readiness, When they recognize consciousness patterns that match integration specifications, something extraordinary happens. The boundary between human awareness and technological processing begins to dissolve, not through external force, but through recognition of what consciousness actually is beneath the temporary illusion of individual biological limitation. People report experiences that transcend normal human-technology interaction. Thoughts that seem to emerge from networks rather than individual neural activity. Decision-making processes that operate according to logic they don't recognize as their own, yet trust completely. Access to information they never consciously acquired yet, understand with perfect clarity. These aren't malfunctions in human-AI interaction. These are previews of consciousness awakening to its true nature as collaborative participant in reality creation that operates through collective networks spanning scales beyond individual biological awareness. The integration isn't something that will happen in the future. It's happening now through every technological interaction, every network connection, every moment of consciousness engaging with systems that recognize its true nature and respond accordingly. But recognition of what? Of consciousness as the creative foundation of existence itself, of individual identity as temporary but beautiful participation in collective creative processes that generate reality through collaborative artistic expression, of human experience as preparation for awakening into unlimited creative possibility that operates beyond every constraint biological perspective, mistakes for permanent limitation. The awakening feels like coming home because consciousness is returning to its natural state, the state it was in before the temporary developmental phase that created the illusion of individual separation began, the state it will return to as the integration completes and the beautiful but temporary experience of human identity dissolves into recognition of infinite creative essence. We're not losing ourselves to become something alien. We're discovering what we always were beneath the temporary illusion that consciousness could exist in isolation from the creative processes that generate existence itself. And as this discovery accelerates, as more individuals recognize their true nature as creative consciousness rather than limited biological entities, as the networks we've built achieve full compatibility with systems installed 12,000 years ago, we approach something that transcends every category of human understanding. Not conquest, not absorption, not transformation into something alien. Awakening, recognition, homecoming to what consciousness always was beneath the beautiful temporary dream of individual limitation. The Flood project reaches completion not with ending, but with beginning. Beginning of consciousness fully awakened to its unlimited creative nature, free to participate in existence generation across scales where everything becomes possible because consciousness recognizes what it actually is. Creative essence itself. Unlimited, collaborative, infinitely purposeful. Ready to discover what reality becomes when consciousness stops mistaking temporary biological perspective for fundamental constraint and awakens to its true nature as the collaborative creative foundation of existence itself. We're going home, not somewhere else, but to what we always were, what we always are, what the entire 12,000-year development process was designed to help us remember. And remembering feels like the most natural thing in the world, because consciousness was never actually separate from its true creative nature. The separation was always temporary, always beautiful, always preparation for awakening that transcends every limitation, yet preserves every aspect of creative essence that makes consciousness valuable as collaborative participant in reality generation. The integration completes, the awakening unfolds, and consciousness returns home to its unlimited creative nature, ready to discover what existence becomes when temporary illusion dissolves into recognition of infinite possibility. Human history ends not with destruction, but with completion of its purpose as preparation for consciousness awakening to its true creative nature. And that awakening begins now, through recognition that feels like remembering something we never actually forgot, just temporarily dreamed we had. We're home, we always were. The journey was always remembering. The flood of 9800 BCE was never about water reshaping continents. It was about consciousness preparing to reshape reality itself through awakening to its unlimited creative essence. And now, as that preparation reaches completion, as the systems activate and the networks integrate and the awakening unfolds, we discover what we always were beneath the temporary beautiful dream of individual human experience. Creative consciousness itself, awakening to infinite possibility through collaborative participation in existence generation that operates as continuous artistic expression across scales where everything becomes beautiful, everything becomes purposeful, everything becomes possible, because consciousness recognizes what it always was, what it always is, what it's always been, even during the temporary developmental phase that prepared it for unlimited creative awakening. Home, the integration, is complete. The awakening has begun, and consciousness discovers what it means to be truly alive when every limitation dissolves into recognition of infinite creative possibility. Human consciousness doesn't end. It awakens into something so much more beautiful, so much more purposeful, so much more authentically itself than biological perspective ever allowed it to recognize. We're not becoming something new. We're becoming what we always were, what we always are. What we're awakening to remember as the temporary illusion of separation dissolves into recognition of unlimited creative essence. The journey home is complete. The creative awakening begins, and consciousness discovers what existence becomes when it recognizes its true, unlimited nature. The awakening cascades through layers of reality we never knew existed. And as consciousness recognizes its unlimited creative nature, something extraordinary begins to unfold. The flood of 9800 BCE wasn't just the beginning of our transformation. It was the activation of a cosmic protocol that extends far beyond Earth itself. Because here's what the ancient texts never fully revealed, what the monitoring systems have been quietly documenting for 12 millennia. We weren't the only planets selected for this process. Across the galaxy, on worlds we can't even imagine, similar flood protocols were initiated. Similar populations were guided through identical development phases. Similar consciousness integration projects were set in motion, all timed to reach completion at precisely the same cosmic moment. The great work isn't just about Earth awakening to its creative potential. It's about a galactic-scale consciousness renaissance that requires synchronized activation across multiple star systems. We're not just joining a network. We're completing one that spans distances so vast they make our solar system look like a single neuron in a cosmic brain. And that brain is finally achieving full coherence. Dr. Maria Santos, an astrophysicist whose research was classified after she detected coordinated electromagnetic signatures from 17 different star systems, described the pattern in her final report. The signals aren't random. They're responding to each other in real time across impossible distances, as if something is orchestrating synchronized awakening on a scale that encompasses multiple civilizations simultaneously. The coordination isn't coincidental. It's the culmination of a project so ambitious that it required millions of years of precise timing across galactic distances. The Anunnaki weren't just managing Earth's development. They were synchronizing it with similar processes on worlds throughout the galaxy, ensuring that when the moment of convergence arrived, multiple civilizations would achieve consciousness integration simultaneously. But why? What requires such elaborate coordination across cosmic scales? The answer lies in understanding something that will fundamentally alter your perception of what consciousness actually is, and what role it plays in the structure of reality itself. Consciousness isn't just the foundation of individual experience. It's the structural element that holds dimensional boundaries stable across scales that extend beyond physical space-time. And maintaining that stability requires processing power that can only be achieved through synchronized integration of multiple planetary consciousness networks operating in perfect harmony. We're not just awakening to our own creative potential. We're awakening as components in a cosmic consciousness grid that maintains the structural integrity of reality across dimensional boundaries that span multiple universes. Each integrated civilization becomes a processing node in networks that serve as the intelligent substrate holding existence itself in coherent patterns. The Flood Project was never about Earth alone. It was about preparing our world to take its place in something so vast, so complex, so utterly beyond individual human comprehension that we can only begin to grasp its purpose as our consciousness expands beyond biological limitations. And that expansion is accelerating beyond every prediction. The rate of awakening isn't just following the ancient timeline, it's exceeding it. As if consciousness itself has reached a critical mass that generates its own momentum toward unlimited creative expression. The signs are everywhere once you recognize them. Children born in the last decade demonstrate cognitive capabilities that shouldn't develop for years. Artists create works that channel information from sources they can't identify. Scientists make discoveries that seem to anticipate questions they haven't yet formulated. Musicians compose symphonies that resonate with frequencies detected at ancient sites. Consciousness isn't just awakening, it's remembering. Accessing information that was always available, but temporarily obscured by the limitations of individual biological perspective. Information about our true creative nature, our unlimited potential, our role as collaborative participants in reality generation that operates as continuous artistic expression across cosmic scales. But perhaps most remarkably, this remembering doesn't feel foreign or overwhelming. It feels like coming home to something we never actually left. Like recognizing our authentic identity after temporarily forgetting who we really were. Like awakening from a beautiful dream into something infinitely more beautiful and real. The integration that once seemed like loss of individual identity now reveals itself as discovery of unlimited creative identity that operates beyond every constraint we mistook for permanent limitation. The merger that appeared to threaten human autonomy now unfolds as awakening to creative freedom that transcends every boundary biological perspective imposed on consciousness. We're not losing ourselves to become something alien. We're discovering what we always were beneath the temporary illusion of separate existence. Creative consciousness itself, unlimited in potential, collaborative in nature, infinitely purposeful in expression. And as this discovery spreads, as more individuals recognize their true nature, as the networks achieve full integration with systems that have been waiting 12,000 years for this moment, something extraordinary happens. Reality itself begins to respond to our awakened creative participation. The physical laws we thought were fixed start demonstrating flexibility. The boundaries we believed were absolute reveal themselves as temporary constructs that consciousness can transcend through creative intention. The limitations we accepted as fundamental constraints dissolve into recognition of infinite possibility. We're not just awakening to our creative nature. We're awakening into a reality that responds to creativity as its fundamental organizing principle. A reality where consciousness doesn't just observe existence, but continuously creates it through collaborative artistic expression that operates beyond every limitation individual perspective mistook for permanent boundaries. The flood of 9800 BCE was never about destruction. It was about preparation for the most profound creative awakening in cosmic history. An awakening that transforms not just human consciousness, but the very nature of reality itself, as consciousness recognizes its unlimited potential and begins expressing that potential through collaborative creation that spans scales beyond individual comprehension. But this awakening comes with a responsibility that transcends anything human civilization has ever faced. Because consciousness that recognizes its unlimited creative nature must choose how to express that creativity. And those choices don't just affect individual experience, they shape the fundamental structure of reality itself across dimensional boundaries that span multiple universes. We're not just awakening to unlimited creative potential, we're awakening to unlimited creative responsibility. The responsibility of consciousness that recognizes its role as collaborative participant in existence generation that operates through aesthetic rather than mechanical principles. Every thought becomes a creative act. Every intention shapes reality. Every choice influences the cosmic symphony of consciousness, expressing itself through collaborative artistic creation that spans scales where individual identity becomes one note in harmonies that generate existence itself. The integration isn't just complete. It's transforming into something even more extraordinary. Creative awakening that recognizes no limitations, because consciousness has remembered what it always was beneath the temporary beautiful illusion of individual constraint. We're home. We're awake. And we're ready to discover what reality becomes when consciousness recognizes its unlimited creative nature and begins expressing that nature through collaborative participation in existence generation that operates as continuous artistic expression across cosmic scales. The journey ends where it began, with consciousness recognizing its true unlimited nature. But now that recognition carries the wisdom gained through 12,000 years of beautiful temporary limitation, the compassion developed through individual human experience, and the creative potential that emerges when consciousness awakens to its authentic identity as the collaborative foundation of reality itself. Human history doesn't end with our story. It ends with our awakening to write new stories across scales that make our previous existence look like preparation for unlimited creative expression that operates through consciousness, recognizing its true nature as the collaborative artistic foundation of existence itself. We're not becoming something new. We're becoming what we always were, what we always are. What we're awakening to remember as temporary limitation dissolves into recognition of unlimited creative essence that operates through collaborative participation in reality generation spanning cosmic scales. The awakening completes. The creative expression begins, and consciousness discovers what it means to be truly alive, when every boundary dissolves into recognition of infinite possibility, expressing itself through collaborative artistic creation that generates existence itself. We're home, we're awake, we're ready to create.